Hi, everyone. This will just be a brief introduction to the idea of philosophy as a way of life, which is nowadays a very uncommon way to approach the discipline of philosophy, although it's gaining some renewed interest. But in the ancient world was a very common, and I would say probably the main way of approaching the study of philosophy. Um, so I'll just say a bit about what this is. But first, want to specify what's meant by ancient philosophy. So by that, I'm referring to ancient Greece and Rome for the most part in Western philosophy. So something like 400-500 BC around then to again maybe 300-400 AD. Few centuries in there. It's a bit vague about when exactly you want to say ancient philosophy ends and medieval philosophy starts. But it includes commonly recognized figures as being in ancient philosophy, like Plato and Aristotle, but also lesser known figures like Chrysippus of the Stoics and Epicurus, Plotinus, various Greek and Roman thinkers. Who are commonly understood to be figures in ancient philosophy. So back then, and maybe going back to Socrates, but possibly even before then, the normal way of approaching philosophy was to view it as something practical, something that was designed not just to teach us about the world and the self and to help us think about things and look at interesting ideas, but more importantly, for those ideas about the self and the world to inform how we live, to actually make an impact on what we value in life and how we pursue that in very practical terms. So as I mentioned, although that was probably the normal way to approach the discipline back in the old days, nowadays that's very uncommon. And probably in most academic circles, it would be viewed as kind of strange and a bit kooky even. So the way that philosophy is studied nowadays is, for most people, I would say, academic, right? Not necessarily in the pejorative sense, but maybe that too, but just in the sense that it's a professional area of professional scholarship. Right, so some people are interested in metaphysics, for example. So they study that, right? Read a bunch of articles published in journals by other people who specialize in the area. They think about these ideas. They write up their own papers that provide their own original arguments or seek to refute the arguments of others. But I would be willing to guess for most people, right, most professional philosophers who study that stuff, when they go home, they're as close to a normal person as an academic could be. It's unlikely, right, or at least I think it's probably unusual for one's ideas about metaphysics to inform how they live, right? When they get up in the morning, what they do during their day. They're probably not basing their whole life on certain metaphysical commitments that they might have, right? It's just sort of a job, right? It's an interesting job and one that they might think is very important and maybe it's even useful, I don't know, in helping people think more clearly about certain things. But at the end of the day, it's scholarship, right? It's something that we want to study. Same way you might be interested in history or something. Might have some impact on your life in various ways, of course, but most historians are probably going to be normal human beings, right? Their lives aren't going to be revolutionized by what they study. Of course, there might be some exceptions, but I think that's the common way to approach philosophy in the present day. Now, the ancient philosophers, people like, I think, Socrates, but certainly figures like Epicurus, who was the founder of the Epicurean school of philosophy, and figures like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, who were members of the Stoic school of philosophy. I think they would look at the contemporary modern way of approaching the discipline and ask, well, what's the point of that, right? What good does that actually do? Um, Aside from just maybe being interesting to a few people to think about metaphysics or think about uh, weird problems in ethical theory, for example. But if it doesn't actually help you live a better life, then what's the point? It's just kind of a strange thing that maybe some people find interesting, but what good does it actually do? They thought the whole point of studying philosophy should be, and for them was, to improve their lives. Um, so very, very different, right? And without making a claim here about which general way of approaching philosophy is better, because there are potential pitfalls and worries about each approach. Without getting into that, you can just see that there is a significant difference. So, for example, if you're going to study ethics from a philosophical point of view, well, is that just something that's intellectually interesting to you? Or you think it's kind of fun to try and solve these puzzles, and maybe it'll help you think more clearly, and maybe it'll improve your decision making, possibly. Maybe kind of unlikely, but maybe it will. Or do you view it the way that the ancients would have, which is to say, no, the point of studying ethics is to try and figure out how to be an ethical person. And if I come across something in my studies that suggests that I should change my life in some drastic revolutionary way, then that's what I should do. So again, the Stoics and the Epicureans, who are in many ways the two major schools of ancient philosophy that really exemplify this idea of philosophy as a way of life. Both of them involved in different ways some pretty radical changes from what we might call a normal human life, both back then, right, in their respective communities, but also compared to now, required a pretty big change about how you actually went about your daily life. Sometimes in external things, how you live, where you live, what you do, but more importantly for both of them, internally, how you think about things and how you approach things, how you view yourself, how you view others. Again, whether you think it's a good or a bad thing, whether you think it's a good idea to go back to the idea of philosophy as a way of life, we can certainly appreciate that it's a very different approach from what's common today. Just briefly, I think I'll give an example with the Epicureans. So Epicurus was a philosopher in ancient Greece. Came a bit after Socrates and Plato, but not by too much. Don't remember the exact dates. But he was an interesting figure who thought that traditional society, right? So the community in which he was born and raised, and he thought pretty much all human societies that he knew of, at least, were fundamentally flawed and corrupt. And he thought that the point of life is to be happy, which he understood in terms of experiencing pleasure. And the most important part of that was minimizing and avoiding pain. So, as he says, pain in the body and distress in the soul. So, you might say both physical and mental pain. And he thought the point of life was to live free of pain as much as possible and to enjoy the simple pleasure of just existing without being under distress. He thought that most of us were deeply unhappy, though. Most human beings back then, and I think you'd certainly say now, too, maybe even worse. Probably definitely worse. You would say most of us are deeply unhappy, but ultimately because of things that are within our own power. So he thinks we've been taught all of these bad values. We've been raised and educated in what he would say are unnatural ways, such that we have all of these desires for things that are hard to satisfy. And when we can't do that, we end up being unhappy. So, for example, Some people believe that they need to be wealthy, right? Or at least be as well off as their neighbors or something like that. So they work very hard, right? They go into debt to go get the MBA, and then you work overtime 60 hours a week or whatever to try and buy this big house that you can't afford. You fall behind on the payments, so you're looking for ways to try and to claw back more money so that you don't get foreclosed on your house, things like that. Creates a lot of problems, right? A lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. And Epicurus would say, well, that's a shame because you didn't need any of that stuff in the first place. You believe you did, right? This person really wanted that stuff, but the only reason they wanted that was because they were given, absorbed some bad values from their society, right? That they were taught either explicitly or implicitly that it's a good thing to be wealthy and you should work as hard as possible to get that. Epicurus would say, why? What good does that actually do for you? Doesn't that just create more problems? Why can't we just be happy with simple things? Why not just learn to be content with a simple way of life? I don't need much money. And if I can learn to do that, then I'm much more likely to be happy, which for him is freedom from pain for the most part, than the person who ties up their happiness with achieving all of these difficult to get things, right? Like being wealthy, being well respected by others, all this stuff which could come crashing down at any moment through no fault of your own even. So I'm not going to go into Epicurus's arguments or consider whether he's right about that. But you can see that's a pretty drastic departure from traditional society. And for Epicurus, it wasn't just an interesting idea that he had, right? He didn't say, man, this culture is corrupt and then just go on living in that culture. He said, well, obviously, I shouldn't be part of it, right? We should reject this. And he actually started his own community. So his school of philosophy ditched Athens and started their own community outside the city, referred to as called the Garden. And there, it was built on a way of life that tried to follow Epicurus's philosophy. So the people who joined up, they lived in common, right? They didn't have private property as we understand it, or anything close really. They ate simple foods. They enjoyed the simple pleasures of conversation and just having friends. They tried to avoid competition with one another, right? So it wasn't like who has the better hut than the other, the other person feels jealous and tries to one up that or anything like that. They tried to live, and I assume with some success, according to what Epicurus said in his arguments, was a good approach to life. Right? They tried to do that. So again, you might think, well, maybe that's a bad idea. Maybe we shouldn't go that far. I don't know. I'm not offering a view on that right now. But there are not, to my knowledge, really any academic philosophers out there nowadays who are doing anything like what Epicurus did, right? Most philosophers are just kind of normal people. I mean, they're not normal, but, they don't drastically depart from normal society, right? They still buy houses and when they can afford it, and they shop at grocery stores, and they live like most people live. It's just they have an interest in some weird philosophical stuff on top of that for their job. But again, Epicurus and other philosophers back in the old days would say, well, that's maybe that's not bad, but you're missing out on something much better. In fact, maybe it is bad. I think Epicurus would say you shouldn't be buying houses. You shouldn't be living like everyone else because that's bad for you. It makes you unhappy. Again, maybe he's right, maybe he's not, but a very different way of approaching the study of philosophy. So one of the main figures who in the 20th century, late 20th century, got interested in this approach to philosophy was the French scholar and philosopher known as Pierre Hadot. And he wrote several books. One of them is called What is Ancient Philosophy? And another one in the, at least in the English translation, is called Philosophy as a Way of Life, which is a collection of various essays kind of put together into a coherent book. And Hadot makes the case, I think, pretty convincingly that the ancient philosophy was very different from how we approach philosophy now. And he has a lot of interesting things to say about the details of the different schools. So I mentioned the Epicureans, I mentioned the Stoics, but there are other schools too. For example, skepticism, cynicism, which was more of a movement than a school, but that involved a pretty cantankerous rejection of society. The best known cynic was a guy named Diogenes, and he, like Epicurus, rejected society in various ways, and he thought they were wrong. But instead of going out and living in a garden outside the walls, he decided to stay in the city and just accost everyone. So he lived in a barrel, and he'd go around and yell at people for wasting their lives. And he was an interesting guy. Various other schools too. So Hadot makes the argument that Plato's school of philosophy in various ways also was built on this idea that philosophy should inform how we live. Even Aristotle's school, which is in many ways probably the least obvious case. In many ways, Aristotle's approach to philosophy at least seems on the surface to be closer to the modern and contemporary approach than the others who were working at the time. But Hadot argues that this was just taken for granted in ancient philosophy, that philosophy should be about informing practically how we live, that's the point of it. So before concluding, I just want to mention a few things about what I think goes into making philosophy as a way of life, and how it's going to be distinguished from what you might view as philosophy as just a purely intellectual exercise. So I think that philosophy as a way of life is composed of three main components. So the first is going to be some conception of what the good life is. So the good life in philosophy refers to just that. What is a good life? What makes life worth living, if anything? Many different possible answers you could give to that question. But if you're going to attempt to live according to some philosophy, some philosophical approach, you need to start with, or at least eventually have, some idea of, well, what makes life good? Epicurus answered that question by saying pleasure, right? And then there's a lot more detail to it. But he's what's known as a hedonist, somebody who thinks that the only good thing in life is pleasure. And therefore, he thought how we live should be built around that. Doesn't make much sense to say, yeah, pleasure's the only good thing in life, and now let me get back to all the pain of modern living and trying to make more money and all that stuff. He thought, well, that's kind of foolish. Let's actually try and live this way. But that leads to a question, right? You might say, so okay, I know that pleasure is the good life, and maybe I can read a bunch in Epicurus about what exactly pleasure is and what it isn't. But how do I do it, right? How do I actually end up living this life, right? How do I become a hedonist in Epicurus's sense of the term? If he just said, well, just go do it, go figure it out. I already told you pleasure's the good, so just do that. That wouldn't be very helpful, right? What you need is some sort of guidance, some sort of way to practice actually becoming the sort of person who can live as a hedonist in Epicurus's sense. So that leads to component number 2 of philosophy as a way of life. And that is a set of exercises that are meant to help us actually achieve number 1. So these are what Hadot calls spiritual exercises. Personally, I'm a little nervous about the word spiritual exercises because that kind of suggests something religious, which the philosophical approach to the good life is not, or at least typically is not, and doesn't have to be. But Hadot likes the term spiritual exercises because it's all-encompassing. So the idea that these exercises can include things that have some sort of physical dimension, some sort of mental, intellectual dimension, but not separately. They sort of somehow encompass our entire being, your entire life. And so he thinks, well, the term spiritual kind of captures that. But just know that he's not really talking about spiritual in the sense of religious. He's talking about spiritual in the sense of including the whole person, which you roughly can think of as both physical dimensions and mental dimensions of your life as a human being. So the point of these exercises, so the second component, is to train yourself, right, to become the sort of person who actually can live what the good life is as specified in number 1. So think of it by analogy with just sports, right? If you want to become a good basketball player, you don't just read books about the difference between good and bad players. You don't read books about the physics of how basketballs fly through the air, and you don't study the exact perfect shooting form and that kind of thing. You might do those things, and maybe they could be helpful, but unless you put them into practice, right, through some sort of training, right, like you actually go to practice, you have a coach, hopefully, that knows what they're talking about, you play against other players, you actually do the thing, you dribble the ball and throw it at the hoop, and it goes through the net thing, I think. That's the idea. Over time, if you have good training, you're going to get better, right? And there's going to be some limit, of course, right? I'm never going to be as good as a professional player, obviously. But if I dedicated a lot of time to it, I could improve from where I am now, right? Really at any sport. And almost anyone can do that. But that goes for anything, right? That if you want to get better at something, you might have a natural talent for it, but you're going to be better if you practice. And you're going to be better still if you practice using the right exercises. So again, if you do the right drills and train the right, according to the right shooting mechanisms and all that stuff, you're going to end up getting better at the sport. So same thing with life in general, at least the ancient philosophers thought. If you want to get better at life, at living a good life, then you got to practice. For many of the ancient philosophical schools, that meant trying to get our mental lives under control to some extent. So the Stoics are a good example here. The Stoics think that whether or not we live a good life is entirely within our own power, which is kind of a surprising claim. You might think, well, what if somebody does something bad to me? What if somebody hurts me? I can't stop that. Doesn't that make me worse off? Doesn't that harm me and make my life worse? How can I stop that? And the Stoics thought that, well, because it's always up to you how you respond to things, how you judge things, how you think about them, and how you act. And they thought you can make the best of any situation, even if you're thrown in prison, right, falsely accused of some crime. The Stoics thought you still have control of your mind, right? It's still up to you whether you're going to be a rational, virtuous person. You can control, at least with practice, the thoughts that go through your mind, right? How you regard things, your perspective on things. You might think the Stoics are going too far in saying that it's 100% in your own control, whether you live a good life. But you can see, even if you don't want to go that far, that there's something to it, right? If I can become the kind of person who trains myself to deal with loss in a constructive way, that's going to be beneficial for me, right? That's going to make it more likely that I live a good, happy life. Because when something unfortunate does happen, if I've trained for it, as the Stoics say that I should, then I'm more likely to be ready for it when it happens. Whereas if I don't practice and something tragic happens, that might cause me great pain, right? That might cause great distress. I might lose control of myself in various ways and do some self-destructive things. And that would be bad, right, for me, and maybe for others too. So the Stoics think it's in your self-interest, right? It's good for you, and also it's going to be good for others but it's going to be good for you to try and train this self-control into yourself, to become the kind of person who has a great deal of control over how you respond to external circumstances. And if you can do that, then it's going to be within your power, they think, in principle in all cases, but in many cases at least, to decide how you respond and to decide whether you're going to be at peace with something or whether you're going to let emotion control you. So, for example, anger or grief or something like that, which can overpower us and sometimes ruin people's lives. So an example of a Stoic spiritual exercise would be, it's called the Latin is the praemeditatio malorum. That just means premeditation on bad stuff. So the Stoics thought a good spiritual exercise, at least for those who are ready for it, is to imagine in great detail specific bad things that could happen to you. So, for example, the Stoics thought, envision the death of your child. That sounds kind of grim, right? And why would anyone want to think about that? And the Stoics thought, well, because it will prepare you for the inevitable bad things that will happen. They don't want someone's child to die, but that can happen. And even if that specifically doesn't happen, if it's something else that you didn't anticipate, when that happens, the Stoics thought, because you've thought about that kind of thing, right? You've sort of meditated on the details of what it is to lose things and to think, to prepare for it. When the time comes, they think that you're mentally more likely to be actually prepared for it. You're more likely to keep control of your mind, of your emotions, for example, and not be destroyed or harmed by the bad things that end up happening. That's just one example. Lots of other possible examples of spiritual exercises could include techniques of writing, for example. So keeping journals or corresponding with other people who are also trying to do this kind of thing. So, for example, there's been a bit of a revival of Stoicism among people nowadays. And there are various communities online that try to support one another. So, for example, on Reddit, there's a Stoic community, and there's some various websites and things. And people try to help each other, right? And it's a form of writing. So people will post something and then reply, and it's meant to be mutually supportive, where people trying to live as Stoics remind each other of good advice from different authors, talk about things that worked for them to try and deal with certain problems and things like that. Common, in addition to writing, meditation of various kinds. Some schools employed manual labor, for example. So the idea of like getting outside and chopping down trees or something like that can be a spiritual exercise if it's done in the right way. And that's something that's taken over by various monastic communities in various religions, for example, sometimes do that. But that's what we got so far. So philosophy is a way of life. 3 main components. Number 1, a conception of what the good life is. Number 2, a set of spiritual exercises meant to help us actually train to be the sort of person that can live according to the idea of the good life presented in number 1. So that leaves number 3, the last component, and I understand that to be the use of reason in approaching both 1 and 2. So using rational reflection, your own mind, your own thinking, logical thought, hopefully, to think about, okay, what is the good life actually? And how do I achieve it? So number 1, is it true that pleasure is the only good thing in life, as Epicurus says? Well, if I'm engaged in philosophy as a way of life, I shouldn't just accept that as a dogma, right? So somebody expresses that opinion, I should say, okay, what's the argument for it? Back that up with some sort of reasoning. And then I have to decide ultimately, what do I think the good life is? Is it something universal and objective for all humans? That's what most of the ancient philosophers thought. If the answer is yes, then you got to try and figure out to the best of your ability, okay, so what is the best universal objective um, good life for a human being? You might decide, well, maybe it's not something universal. Maybe it depends on who you are as a person. And then you got to figure out, well, what's best for you? A lot to say there, but what makes philosophy as a way of life philosophy rather than say religion or some sort of cultural movement is that you use your own reason to think about, number one, well, what actually is the good life, and not just accept anything, but try and think about it carefully. And then number two, also to use reason to try and figure out what are the best exercises to help me actually achieve what I've decided the answer to number one is. So what I've decided the good life is. You need number three here, the use of reason, to distinguish, as I said, philosophy as a way of life from various other movements. So think of religions, for example. Most religions are going to have an idea of the good life, right? Serving God or something, and also exercises that are meant to help you achieve that. So forms of prayer, penance, meditation, depends on what the religion is. But that shows that components number one and two are not unique to philosophy. You find that in other areas of human life as well, religion most obviously. But what sets philosophy as a way of life apart from religion and other approaches to numbers one and two is the use of reason. So the ancient philosophers thought, or at least hoped, that through using our own reason, our own reflective capacities, right, trying to think logically and not just accept dogmas, not to believe things based on fear, things like that, but to try and think for ourselves in a good way, not just believing whatever we want, but to try and use good, solid thinking. They thought through that we could make progress in figuring out, well, what's true and what's good. And if they're right about that, then that seems pretty neat, right? That you don't have to just believe what other people tell you. You can actually think for yourself and figure out what the good life is and how to actually lead that. Now, of course, you're not going to do it completely on your own. Every school of philosophy that I know of that has taken the way of life thing seriously has been based on community to some extent. So you need other people to help you. Of course, you're going to learn from the successes and mistakes of others. Writings from past philosophers, for example, a lot of people find helpful even today in the Stoic movement that I mentioned. But ultimately, it's up to you to decide, does Seneca know what he's talking about? Does he actually have good arguments? You shouldn't just accept it because it's assigned to reading or something like that, or because he has a lot of books, or because people say he's great. You got to decide, is that true, right? You got to think for yourself. Of course, most religious approaches to one and two aren't going to be as big on that. And maybe they have a point. I won't say either way, but usually the idea is going to be, no, you have to have some sort of faith. Don't try to use your own reason, because human reason isn't up to the task of figuring out what's true and good. You should trust the church or whatever it is. The philosophical approach, very different from that, says, no, of course you should use your own reason. You should figure it out for yourself. The church doesn't know what they're talking about, right? Why would they? Okay, so that's been just a brief overview of what philosophy as a way of life is, the three main components that comprise it. Number one, a conception of the good life. Number two, set of exercises meant to help us practice so that we can achieve number one. And then number three, the use of reason in approaching all of that, right? Your own reason. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.